Welcome, everyone, to Communal Conversations, Diversity and Jewish Leadership, a discussion with Jews of color here in Minnesota. With us today, we have Alene Sussman, Director of the Jewish Community Foundation of the Minneapolis Jewish Federation, and she's a member of Temple Israel.
Thanks, Sheree, for having me.
Robin Washington. He is a Wisconsin Public Radio Public Affairs show host, and he is one of the newest board members of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas. Welcome, Robin.
Be here, thank you.
Enzi Tanner, licensed social worker and Shir Tikva member.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Christine Smith. She works for the state of Minnesota, developing strategies to increase diversity and inclusion's competencies among staff, as well as strategic direction for external stakeholders. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
And I am Sheree Curry, moderator of today's session, and I am a member of Jewfolk's Board of Directors and a member of Adopt Restoring Congregation and its anti-racism committee. This Jewfolk Jaycation series is about relaxation outside of work. But we all know that we can't take a vacation from diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. When we market travel and vacation, diversity should be a forethought. When we plan programming at any organization, diversity should be a forethought. When companies look at recruitment and retention policies, diversity should be a forethought. Jewish organizations once were considered to be diverse if they were inclusive of Orthodox, conservative, and Reform members. In recent years, they have taken a harder look at being inclusive of its growing racial and ethnic membership. The Minneapolis Jewish Federation recently released a 2020 population study in partnership with Brandeis University. It revealed that 7% of Jewish households here in Minnesota includes a person of color. That means there are more than 1,000 Jews in Minnesota who identify as people of color. This is likely a conservative estimate because I know I didn't participate in the survey. I know some other Jews of color who did not participate in the survey sample. So I want to start with Christine, because your mother is half Native American and Black, your father is an Ashkenazi Jew, and the rest of your Jewish family are Orthodox Jews. Mm-hmm. Because your mother isn't Jewish, a member of your Jewish family didn't consider or don't consider you to be Jewish. But the Minnesota Chabad community has been very welcoming to you as you connected with your Jewish roots. Mm-hmm. Tell us the impact that has had on you and why the Jewish community needs to be welcoming of its ethnically diverse population.
Yes. I love that question. So there is some new emerging research called epigenetics. And that research talks about the transference of trauma from one generation to the next. They haven't tested on humans yet, but they have been able to see that if a grandparent or parent has experienced trauma, that can transcend out to children. What we also know is when we're looking at resilience is that people having connection to community and culture and spirituality can also mitigate the impacts of trauma and can also cause people who don't have those things even more harm if you don't have that connection and haven't experienced trauma. I, being a person of African American, American Indian, and Jewish descent, come from historical trauma in my DNA. However, part of the epigenetic study is kind of like that nature versus nurture conversation. It's really just emerging the two and saying in science that a person can have something in their DNA, but depending on the environments they're in is what part of their DNA will be expressed. So if you have a history of trauma and you are in a traumatic situation in your generation, that trauma response could come up and look in lots of different ways. However, the reverse is also true, is that if a person is around community and culture and spirituality that is likened to that of their ancestors, that can also be an extremely profoundly, deeply healing experience for a person, really help them to reverse some of those negative impacts that we're starting to learn more and more about of trauma. So I would say that the experience that I had being welcomed into a community that's so very, very different from mine, right? Even just my name alone can be offensive to people. And I was able to meet people halfway. I was totally fine with the rabbi who is friends with my family, was friends with my grandmother. He wanted to call me Chaya. That was totally fine with me. My uncle is a Hasidic rabbi and he prefers to call me Marie. Totally fine with me. I don't have any problems with that at all. But the warmth and the generosity and the kindness that was shown to me and my husband and my family was tremendously profound and has touched my heart. And while I don't choose to want to take upon the 613 commandments that my relatives are, participating in, I do have a deep respect, appreciation, and I feel a strong connectedness to the community.
Yeah, thank you. That's really very interesting for us. And Alene, you identify as an Asian Jew of color. Can you explain how you see Asian Jews as being accepted and treated within the Jewish community?
Yes. So like all humans, Asians come in a variety of hues and experience different levels of acceptance or non-acceptance in the Jewish community. My own personal experience growing up Jewish in Minneapolis was that I rarely felt like I belonged or was welcome. I am Chinese and Caucasian, and depending on the other person, they might perceive me as an Asian or white, or maybe they're not sure, but generally something other than them. And throughout my childhood, I went to kind of through the traditional Jewish upbringing. I went to synagogue, I went to Talmud Torah, 4 to 5 days a week. I was bat mitzvahed. I strongly identified as Jewish. And I was told by my family and the organizations with which I participated that, you're a Jew, you're part of the Jewish people. However, often I was the only person of color in those spaces and was not included in the social aspect of those spaces. People would barely speak to me outside of the formal learning time. Kids and adults, when they would speak to me, they would ask me, if I was adopted, if I converted, if I was Jewish, or what I was even doing there. Questions that would never be asked of a white Jew in that same space. And each time that I experienced it, it chipped away at my connection to Judaism and increased my feelings of isolation within the community and made me honestly feel rejected by my own people. Ultimately, the result of that was that I felt like an outsider amongst my own people, like I didn't belong, like I was invisible, which was very painful since I was told over and over again, that I'm a Jew. So imagine what that feels like to be treated and feel like an outsider amongst those who are supposed to be your community. After my bat mitzvah, my connection to Judaism was completely broken. The hurt and the pain that I experienced really drove me away from the Jewish community. I wanted nothing to do with Judaism. I didn't even go to high holiday services. I didn't have any connection to my Judaism for many years. And time has passed and that has since changed. But the lesson really is that no one should be made to feel like a stranger amongst their own people. The work that needs to be done on an organizational and individual level is so important for many reasons. But one of those reasons is to ensure that Jews of different hues feel like they belong, that they are connected to other Jews, that these are their people and that this is their community.
And thank you. Yeah, I think that's really, we also look at being members of whether it's our synagogues or other Jewish organizations. And Robin, you just joined the board of MNDAC JCRC. And through the years, you've been very active in the Duluth Jewish community on a national basis, as being the founder of the Alliance of Black Jews. You're a co-moderator of the group I founded, blackandjewish.com. So, but can you kind of tell us a little bit, when you are asked to be on a board or a part of a committee, does it feel like tokenism? as one of the few Jews of color usually associated with that? Or is it important to be around that table no matter what?
So I'll tell you actually why I was asked in a minute, but first I want to go to the word tokenism, which kind of grates on me because it smacks of white people projecting their sense of who we are on us and their worry about, gee, what do we think about it and how are we going to feel, right? There's this great argument against affirmative action that is rather species that unfortunately Jewish organizations embrace. At the time of the Baki decision that started turning back affirmative action, that while people of color or Black people are going to feel bad knowing they got the job just because they were Black. Read my lips on this. Nobody gets the job just because you're Black. There's two standards, qualified and unqualified. I can go on that one later. Tokenism, as I said, grates on me. We're having a discussion right now on Wisconsin Public Radio on these weighty issues, and I know Minnesota Public Radio is in even deeper waters on this. Really over people using the word token. And I say, if you're worried about people and how they're going to feel about something, if you keep calling them up, women to talk about women's issues, Hispanics to talk about issues of Latinx, you know what? Maybe your worry is you're pigeonholing them. How about that? Rather than tokenizing. Let's work with the language there first, because there are filters and well springs that different people react to differently. Okay, enough about tokens. So what does it actually mean? If I'm asked to be part of something and they need some diversity on their staff, am I worried about that? Well, actually, I'd rather be there than not be there. And I'd rather me be there, with all due respect toward my sistren and brethren, other Black Jews, Jews of color, or whatever, that they're not be there. If I'm not there, well, I don't have to finish this sentence, right? If you don't have a seat at the table, you're the dinner. So, you know, I'm not shy, and I don't want people to be shy about asking me to be in it. That said, after a while, if you still can't find another Jew of color, I'll help you. And yes, there is a fee for doing that. One last thing, how did I get on the board of JCRC? I've known Steve Hunix and the council for many years, and have had some serious conversations and very light conversations too. I did a study that was published in several Jewish newspapers. I did it, premiered it on the Nicole Lachon site about the diversity of Jewish boards. And I had a column that went with that because I am a journalist. And it basically showed that however you slice it, whatever number you get of what the population of Jews of color is, it is not at all represented in the board members or the board member makeup of major Jewish organizations. I and my assistant went through every one of those organizations, 53 listed, and we look up my website. I'll post it on there. You can see the.
Right, and you're at robinwashington.com or .com, I believe, so people can
robinwashington.com
site to see that. And let me transition that to Enzi, as you're a community organizer, you're a social worker, community organizer, and you've dealt with a lot of different issues dealing with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And you've sit on a lot of panels like this one. I'm asking you to come and a lot of others as well. So do you feel sometimes, you know, you're stretched thin, being asked, you know, to do this and considered important work? Or what do you have to say about that?
You know, that's a good question. I don't feel stretched thin. I think 10 years ago, yeah, when it felt as if every time I had to say yes. In fact, right before this call, I was on another panel for Black trans folk to have a conversation. And for me, it feels as if there's a lot of people around that can't do it. And so I say yes when I'm available. And also, I don't mind being asked because there's lots of other folks available, and I try to send it to other people's towards other people's ways, etc. And there's a lot of us, and so the thing that shifted it for me, and that made it not seem so thinned or so stressed, is knowing so many more Jews of color, and knowing that there's so many of us out there. It kind of shifts the narrative, because we've been so used to the narrative that other folks have been giving us, that we don't exist, and we know that that's not true. And because it's not true, it at least for me, it shifted the way in which I said yes and the way in which I say no. I have no problem saying no, especially after the uprising. I'm very clear now about saying no when I need to say no, because it's important that we all take care of ourselves, and it takes time sometimes to get there. I couldn't do that in my 20s, but.
Okay, so actually as a follow-up, Enzi, do you think Jewish organizations are doing enough to find new, fresh voices for these boards and committees? Or how best can they approach the situation?
Yeah, that's a doing enough. That's a hard question, right? Because the answer would be no, but it's not no because folks aren't trying. It's no because there's never going to be enough, right? This is a journey. This is going to be constantly a goal that we're always looking for. And in some ways, the verdict is also still out. We've seen that many organizations, even before the uprising, with a commitment towards particularly Jewish organizations, with a commitment towards hiring more Jews of color to staff and towards more Jews of color to the board. And there's still a lot of more work to do. One of the realities is oftentimes Jews of color are not put in positions or not asked to do things unless it's about diversity or equity. And so one of the pieces is also reminding folks that we are a very talented group of folks in many different areas. And so one way is inviting folks to be involved in every different aspect. And another thing is the Jew of Color Initiative. It used to be called the JLCI Field Building Initiative. They just announced a grant opportunity for organizations who want to provide leadership opportunities and leadership trainings for Jews of color. And I think that's very important, because oftentimes folks might say, well, they don't know how to do the work. They may not be talented, or how do we get people to the board, et cetera. Funding, right? Getting money available so that we can train up Jews of color. There's a lot of particularly young Jews of color who they become bar mitzvah or b'nai mitzvah, they disappear, they leave. What would it look like if if they see themselves in all aspects, as well as knew that they would be able to be involved, and given the skills, the support, and the financial backing by their congregation? That would be amazing.
Okay. Yeah, and Christine, that's important what Enzi's saying too, because research shows that companies with diverse leadership on staff and on their boards outperform companies with non-diverse leadership. So why are we still fighting for more diversity in leadership today?
Right. So according to Forbes, Minnesota makes the top 10 best places to live in the entire country. The reason being because we have phenomenal health, phenomenal schools, environmentally, it's a wonderful place to live. However, when we look a little bit deeper at the data and we disaggregate by race, you see that African Americans specifically and American Indians specifically have extremely high disparities as it compares to our white populations. As a person that is from that background and has kind of been studying and understanding that for a while, I look to it being a combination of two things. One is historical trauma, the impacts of chattel slavery and genocide for African American and American Indian folks. And then also unconscious bias, right? So as we are transitioning and evolving as a country, there hasn't been the type of education that was done hundreds of years ago to allow chattel slavery and the type of genocide that took place, right? So all the media and the advertisement and education of very small young children about Black folks, right? And about Native folks being savages and Black folks being likened to animals, et cetera, right? There was a lot of intentional efforts done to create that ideology so that when folks grew up into a decision-making adults, they would make decisions and policies and funding choices based on those ideologies. And while we have evolved and we don't have boarding schools anymore and chattel slavery is not allowed, we still have the residue left over. Our communities have the residue, but we also have the residue within institutions that consist of individuals. Right here in Minnesota, in Duluth, for example, just recently that history was talked about with the 3 men that were broke out of the jail and hung, right, in the middle of the city. And if you look up pictures to see that event that took place, that horrific, tragic event that took place, you see little children around seeing those men being hung, smiling with their parents. And as we know, nobody is born racist. Nobody is born hateful. We're taught that. And it really happens in those formative years. And in order to not be that way, we have to unteach that. And if I have several children, right? And when I look at their K through 12 education, and even my own K through 12 education, I was not taught about the actual history that took place. I was taught one narrative, and it was the narrative of those that colonized. And it makes total sense, right? And I think it's a benefit for me to be mixed, because I actually do have compassion for white folks, right? That don't know and understand. How would you? I've had to seek this out. I've had to pay to learn about my own ancestors' history. I still have to pay to be educated to learn about my own ancestors' culture and history from the Black and Native side. So it makes total sense when my white colleagues have no understanding of Tulsa, Oklahoma, or the boarding schools and the impact that the boarding schools had on Native American people. It makes total sense. So I think a lot of the folks that are in leadership in organizations today were once those children that were being taught by a very predominantly white society and culture, and taught some of that ignorance as well. And so I think we have to be very intentional in institutions to create some policy, system, and environmental changes that start to reverse that old ideology in structural bias and how it plays out in resulting in disparities.
Yeah, thank you. And we just really have only a couple minutes left. So Alene, real quickly, can you tell us, when it comes to the Jewish community, should the onus be more on us as Jews of color to seek work for Jewish organizations to help kind of break down some of those barriers? Or is it on the organizations themselves to recruit more?
Well, first of all, I'm relatively new to the Jewish professional world. I have not seen more than a few BIPOC Jewish professionals around the nation, just to kind of set the context. Maybe they're out there and I just haven't met them yet. That's possible. But if there is a lack of them, then, this is a problem, because as Christine was saying, people who work at the organizations, whether Jewish or not, they're the ones creating the policies along with the boards. They're creating the programming. They're doing outreach to the community. And so diverse viewpoints should be voices at those tables, and organizations should reflect the diversity that exists within the Jewish people, because it does, and include those perspectives in their thinking and their work. And if they don't, should be doing all they can to change that culture so that they can attract and retain the best talent and the most diverse pool of talent as possible. Why this is the case and whether Jews of color should, try to work with these organizations, maybe partly they don't want to, and it's self-selective, because maybe they don't feel welcome at Jewish organizations due to interactions they may have had in their, prior Jewish life, where maybe they feel like the community has rejected them. Maybe they don't see people who look like them working at these organizations. So maybe they wonder, is this going to be a place for me? If those things were different from a structural perspective or standpoint, then maybe more BIPOC Jews would be interested in working at these organizations. I know that there's a national effort really quickly by the Jewish Federations of North America. They hired a gentleman named Rabbi Isaiah Rothstein to look into this and try to really dig deep to figure out what's going on. But, on a local community here, we've had a lot of strife. And there have been tears in the community that have been there for a really long time. And George Floyd's murder have created those tears and really, increased those tears. And those things need to be solved. And whether that means bringing on people in leadership positions from a staff or a volunteer perspective, or organizations really looking at themselves from an honest and authentic way, I think that really needs to happen. And, it needs to be part of the everyday work that organizations do.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Robin, in like 30 seconds, tell us, take a final thought here. So this intentional racial diversity at Jewish institutions, is it a fad that's going to change, fade in a couple of years, do you think? Or is this the start, because of George Floyd and everything else, a resurgence that's going to continue in the right direction for Jewish organizations?
Well, very quickly, going back to my study, the number, by the way, was 0.2% Black Jews on the boards of the major Jewish organizations in the United States. Totally unacceptable by any definition. We are more a higher percentage, the lowest being 2% of the Jewish population of this country.
And so moving forward.
And so moving forward on this thing, is it a fad? It may be. It reminds me of 1968. And as a journalist, there's something I call the class of 68, which is Black journalists who suddenly were recruited by white-owned newspapers and TV stations to go cover the riots because the white folks are getting beaten up and they couldn't cover it. And suddenly, these Black people who have been reporting for the Black press and doing all kinds of things were suddenly qualified. So yes, George Floyd, same sort of thing, an emergency call. Oh my God, we suddenly realized this. Is it sustainable? We need to make it happen. We need to make it sustainable.
Thank you, Robin. And I think all of us agree with that. So I want to thank you to all of our attendees today, and to you at home for tuning in, but also for your commitment to be more diverse and inclusive as we strive for a more anti-racist society and an anti-racist Jewish community. Thank you very much.